Байрам Мустафа Байрамали е българо-турски визуален изследовател, журналист и арт-активист. Той живее по принцип в Лондон, но е дете на български турци, преживели етническото прочистване по време на комунистическия режим в България. И може би за това толкова силно го вълнува темата за паметта и помирението и за влиянието на тези процеси върху поколенията. Байрам Байрамали очаквам сега на сцената.
Здравейте.
Заповядайте.
So, hello everyone, my name is Bayram and thank you for being here. As it was said, I have been researching for the last 5 years the different experiences of my family members and survivors and political prisoners of the so-called revival process. This was the process, or that term came from the communist regime, but eventually it really means the assimilation and the ethnic cleansing and the deportation of Bulgarian Turks. And I want to open a parenthesis here saying that this process didn't only affect exclusively Bulgarian Turks, but Roma community, the Bulgarian Muslim community, the Jews and Armenians in Bulgaria as well. And before I start, I would like to read a small story which was composed from the interviews that I have done with my family members and the survivors, because I believe that this story in itself and the personal stories and the stories about remembering cannot be really experienced so much of like different generations, but they can be translated and migrated. How to tell a shattered story. How to translate fragmented sentences, pauses, and changes of intonation. Can you register a dislocation? How to narrate a story with no ending and beginning. How to imagine an intergenerational narrative, non-linear advance, and a story that does not belong to you, but left you with trauma. I felt an urge to learn that story, to listen, to utter, and reimagine it. I looked at my uncle, my aunts, my grandparents, and I saw a pattern. A pattern that runs in the family, a pattern of not belonging. And sometimes you find yourself in a loop of history which you cannot break out of. My story and the story of my parents are so interconnected that I was unable to differentiate between them and myself anymore. The story you will hear now is a diasporic story with a double act of translation. One migrated from Turkish to Bulgarian and then from Bulgarian to English. One might argue that translating a story from one language to another loses its cultural specificity, while it might also allow for a new possibility. I will let you decide which function this translation offers. I live by migration. I belong to many places. I live by translation. I have many tongues, voices, and accents. I live in between, and I have lived through many generations. What happened to us might not affect you, and what happened to us you wouldn't be able to read in the news. However, what happened to us will someday resurface. And the mountain has overturned. It was not the mountain that surrounded the area I grew up in. Everything had a different name. There was new rules, a new way of being. One day we woke up and they told us that we need to accept the new reality for what it is. I was called Boris. I had a new identity card. We heard that they were coming. They were speaking for us now. They defined our mother tongue, our religion, and our names. They put the ones that were opposing to the new rules in the prisons and in the concentration camp. We had to hide in the forest. We stayed wrapped in nylon, 15 days and 15 nights under the trees. A sense of disillusionment, loneliness, grief, incipient insanity, and a desperate search for refuge. All covered in sheet of plastic nylon. 15 days and 15 nights. Some called us refugees, and some claimed that we were going to a big excursion. So now we had 2 names, 2 identities, 2 religions, and 2 homes, and 2 countries to live in between, 2 continents and 2 selves. Neither this nor that. Somewhere between Europe and Asia, we tried to belong. But as nobody really asks what happens to a person whose economic, social, and political position might not afford him or her the opportunity to create a new country out of their sense of displacement. In another sense, what happened to people who cannot go back to their hypothetical reality of homes? Is this the clay out of which refugees are molded? Can you prescribe any of these adjectives to me? My experience, how does my experience construct my existence? What I am molded from? Am I a child of refugees, a child of immigration, a child born up despite of ethnic cleansing, a child with a second generational trauma? Can you explain why people carry memories of others? I still remember my dear auntie weeping, shedding tears like she never did before. I was only 7. My grandparents were in Verbino. That night in 1989, they stayed there with the rest of my family before they crossed the border to Turkey. They were on the road to life of exile. That night, my uncle wasn't with them. He had to attend his compulsory military service. As my uncle, the son of my auntie, was not allowed to travel with his family. However, my auntie's son was there in the back of the car, trying to pass the border with his parents. Stuffed in carpet, died of suffocation. Who killed him? His Turkish mother, or rather his Bulgarian named mother, or the Bulgarian state. So it all started my research and the idea why I was so intrigued in the story of my family and what happened during the communist regime between 1895 to 1896 was when I was a child, every time we would be together, my family would joke around themselves and say, oh, this was my Bulgarian name and this is my Turkish name. And I never understood that, why they would have 2 names and why I only have 1 name. And then when I was in 11th grade, I remember that we had a history class in the end of the year when we would discuss the so-called revival process or the assimilation of Bulgarian Turks in 1989 and the so-called Big Excursion, which is the deportation of 3,100 Bulgarian Turks. And I was the only Turkish student in the class. And during that lesson, my history teacher told us that actually a lot of Bulgarian Turks at the time, when this assimilation process was happening, they were happy to be renamed with Bulgarian names. It was just too forceful. So that's why there was a lot of violence happening. And I knew that from the stories I was hearing again and again and again from my parents, that was not true. They were never happy to have new names. They were never happy for their deceased grandparents to be renamed on the stones of their graveyards as well. But that was never discussed in a history class. So when I started my studies in the UK, I was really perplexed of the story of this migration and deportation, and as I was migrating myself. I started researching what has actually took place, and I went and interviewed a lot of political prisoners and survivors of the assimilation process and people who have been in the concentration camp of Belene. The first person that I contacted at the time was Mikhail Ivanov, who is one of the people who has helped a lot of Turkish people at the time and who established the Council for Reconciliation between Bulgarian and Turks in 1989. And he has written extensive research on the stories of different individuals who experienced this process. And it was very funny to me. The one thing that he gave me was titled Like on a Holiday, referencing the Big Excursion as if they are going on a holiday. And it was at the same time strange to receive this because my name is Bayram, which means in Turkish a holiday. So the other person that I've contacted and I was in touch with at the time was the Isa Agushev, who is like amateur archivist who collects images of the Haskovo region at the time. And he gave me a couple of images at the time that were not archived in the Bulgarian archive. And for me, this was very interesting because since a child, I knew that this process was happening, but it was all vocational. There was no visual representation of what took place. And that was to me, in some sort of a way, I thought that if I have these images, if I see them, I will be able to trace back what has took place during that night when my auntie's son has died from suffocation. If I find the traces, if I find some visual clues, I can trace back and understand their traumas and the trauma of my family. Another auntie of mine, when they traveled to Turkey, her house was seized. And this is from the Bulgarian state, and it was demolished. And she was not paid no reparations at the time when she came back from Bulgaria. And these two images, for me, they were very interesting because for me, this was the only representation I can get of actually houses of Bulgarian Turks being demolished at the time. And the image over there was from a protest from the Haskovo region when people were against the renaming process. And again, for me, this was quite interesting to see and very important to see because I knew that there was a resistance and that resistance was documented. But the one image that really stuck my mind at the time, and I keep looking back at it, re-looking at it as well, was this image that was given to me from the amateur archivist as well. And this image is an image from the so-called Big Excursion, or the deportation of Bulgarian Turks in 1989. This was one of the few images that were taken from a Bulgarian photojournalist, and it wasn't taken from a Western photojournalist. And as you can see, there is a row of cars, and they're old, probably Moskvich cars. And there is a lot of house equipment wrapped in nylon. So I kept looking at this image to find clues of what took place and why they were stopping, like why there was a row, why they were not traveling. And that was making a lot of sense to me because when my grandparent was telling the story of my uncle dying, the son of my auntie dying, sorry, he remembers how there were different passages. People were allowed to enter Turkey at different times. So they would stay during the night in the village of Verbino. And the road was very long. And my auntie's son, they decided that they will put him in one of these types of cars. And they will wrap him in a rodopsku odeao. And they wouldn't be able to check on him because there would be a lot of police at the road trying to control the row. And as you can see, there's different people, and I kept wondering whether I can find my parents at one of these images. Who would be these people looking at the row, and why would they pose for the photographer? But the main character of this image that really stayed with me was this woman who is wearing a headscarf. And as some of you might know, wearing a headscarf at the time was banned. So people who would women who would wear headscarves would be fined. And at the time when I was looking at the image, I was speaking with my grandmother, and she was saying that how she was fined a couple of times for wearing a headscarf because she didn't realize that there was new rules, that there was new etiquette of wearing clothes outside. And over the years, I have started documenting and photographing different places that are relevant to my family and the people that I have interviewed. And in this room, this is the old room of my mother, where she stayed locked alone when without realizing in 1985, there was a lot of tanks in the Turkish neighborhood in Haskovo, and they occupied the neighborhood in between like 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. so people cannot pass by. But my grandparents went to work like at 8, and my mom would go to school at 10. So she wanted to go out, but she was alone. So she was she saw the military, and they asked her, so what's your name? And she said, my name is Sevinch. And they asked her, is this a Bulgarian or Turkish name? And she said, it's a Turkish name. And she was asked to go back home and stay there until she has a new one. So throughout the day, she stayed in this room, and all she was telling me during the time was how she wished her parents were there because she didn't know what was happening. And as I referred in the story before, there was a lot of people who have told me how throughout the process, in small villages across the Rhodope Mountains, they would do this kind of processes, and the military would come and force people to change their names. But a lot of people would go to the mountains and hide because there would be news coming from a village to a village that the military is coming, and they are coming with a imenlik, with a book with names you can choose from. So people thought at these villages that if they hide long enough, if they go to the mountains, they would be able to surpass the process, but they were never able to. And one of the villages that I kept coming back to is called Dureshari. That village is now desolate, and during my research, I've tried to interview a couple of people from there. It is in the next to Krumovgrad. And in that village, there was around 50 families who were deported to Turkey, and they never came back. So now this village is desolate, and nobody lives there anymore. So I kept going back there, and I realized that this is a very particular thing that I would like to explore during this research. And I titled the research "The Big Homecoming" in a way of reenacting the Big Excursion, going back to the places that we were forced to flee. I went there with my family. I went there with a lot of different people, and I've tried to document it. But I realized that what I really wanted to do with this place is to reenact the history class that I never had, and I wish I had, with my history teacher. So I collaborated with Sofia Platform, and we organized a history class for 150 high school students at the time. And I showed different parts of my research, different images, and we had survivors from the concentration camp, Turkish survivors from the concentration camp, who came and had a class with them. But the whole idea of the Big Homecoming for me is in a way of understanding how intergenerational trauma affects me, and how my family have been affected, and how I can tell the story without re-traumatizing other people, but in a way of finding peace and reconciliation as well. And I will just leave you with this quote from Ariela's life, and that's it. Thank you so much.